This is At Ease, the military podcast of Thomas Nelson Community College. I'm Gary Pounder. And on this edition of the pod, we're going to delve into the always fascinating realm of military history, something that you have told us you'd like to hear from time to time. Well, you asked for it, and we're glad to oblige. For our first foray into the topic of military history, we're going to talk to a man who's really at the forefront of both new media and military history. His name is Ray Harris Jr., and over the past decade, he's created one of the most popular and listened to podcasts focusing on the Second World War. It's called the History of WWII Podcast, and if you have any interest in that conflict, it is definitely appointment listening. We'll have more on the podcast and its creator in just a moment. But first, a question for the airmen in our audience. Have you finished your associate degree from the Community College of the Air Force? You know it's important for your career, and the service, let's face it, makes it easy. Most of the credits come from your basic training, tech school, and OJT. In fact, the only thing left then are those 5 general education classes you must complete with a civilian school. And that's where we come in. Thomas Nelson is now the newest member of the CCAF GEM program. That makes us a preferred provider of those general ed classes for airmen completing their CCAF degrees. We offer a wide selection of classes, online delivery, and a tuition discount no matter where you're stationed in the Air Force. Learn more about TNCC and the GEM program at tncc.edu/military/GEM, G-E-M. Finishing your CCAF? It's closer than you think. At Thomas Nelson, the Peninsula's community college, serving airmen around the world for more than 50 years. As I mentioned during the intro a moment ago, our guest today is Ray Harris Jr. He is the creator and host of the History of WWII Podcast. As I said earlier, if you have any interest in World War II at all, this is absolutely appointment listening. I got hooked on the podcast over a year ago. And I really encourage anybody who has even a passing interest in the conflict to check out the podcast. And Ray also has a lot of great material on his website that goes along with that as well. We'll talk more about that here in a moment. Ray, first of all, thank you for taking time out of your very busy schedule to join us here on At Ease.
Absolutely. Anytime I can come on someone's show and we can talk about something that we enjoy discussing together, obviously something as important as World War II, I am happy to do it at any time.
And we certainly appreciate that. Let's talk about how you got in the business of being a podcast creator and host. You mentioned on the podcast several times that your father was a career Air Force officer, so I guess technically you were a military brat. You grew up on military installations. Do you think that background drove any kind of interest you may have developed in World War II and in history in general?
Actually, no, it drove me away from history and military stuff. My father was in the Air Force for 25 years. It was great for him. He got to do a lot of exciting things. We got bounced around every 2 or 3 years. So not the greatest thing for us, but the military brats have their own community. They take care of each other. So that's what got us through those years of just bouncing around every 2 or 3 years.
I know what you mean. I'm retired Air Force myself, and I've got 4 military brats of my own, and they say, and the moving experience was great, but curiously enough, none of them chose to follow Dad in the Air Force or military career, and I certainly understand why. But now you have talked about, in terms of where this interest came from, that At the age of 12, you became very interested in World War II. Was there a particular book, a film, an experience that really triggered your initial interest in World War II as a topic?
This is going to sound very weird. This is probably the strangest answer you've ever gotten to this kind of question. I was a little boy. I was about 10 years old, and the TV show Hogan's Heroes came on. And I didn't know anything about anything, so I was watching it because it's a comedy. And I'll make this short. In the show, they would drop certain German words, Fräulein, Frau, Guten Tag, Mein Herr, whatever. And I can't make this make sense, and I'm not even going to try, but when I heard those German words, I instantly fell in love with the German language. I think it's beautiful. Do I speak it? No, of course not, but I think it's a beautiful language. And so I started investigating the history of Germany, and this is before the internet, so picture a little boy with a bunch of encyclopedias, on the living room floor, and Germany's contributions to science, mathematics, philosophy, music, everything. And so I fall in love with this country. I fall in love with this culture. And because my research was haphazard at best, I eventually stumbled into World War I and World War II. And it just made me so sad that this country that I have come to love, even though I don't know anything about it, I was just researching, did these two horrible things. And so I think trying to understand how this beautiful culture could be a part of these two horrific events is something that, even though I was 10 or 11 years old, I wanted to figure out why. That didn't make any sense to me. So that's when I started reading a whole bunch of books. The very first one I read, and I do not recommend this starting out, is William Shire's The Rise and Fall of the Third Reich. I read it once, didn't get most of it, read it a second and third time, and it made a lot more sense. But so those two events, reading that book and watching that TV show and falling in love with the German language. So I kind of backed into studying World War II history, if you will.
And you've also mentioned on the podcast, too, that, your academic background, you got your undergraduate degree at JMU here in Virginia. Mm-hmm. You're still based in Virginia to this day. Yeah. With a history degree, was that part of your focus academically at JMU? Did you try to take as many classes focusing on World War II as part of your history undergraduate degree?
Right. Well, since I wanted to become a teacher, that was pretty much it. I just wanted to be a high school teacher. I thought that would be really fun. I just took the classes that I needed to get through to get the degree because I had to take up other classes for the teaching certificate. I did manage to take a couple of classes on World War II, the causes, Cold War, the big events. And I enjoyed those. But if anything, those made me want to learn the nitty-gritty details, which, of course, I wouldn't explore until years later when I started the podcast. Basically, the podcast and everything else is my search to better understand the events because they're so massive you could spend the rest of your lives reading through them and never really know everything. But for whatever reason, that is the task that I have set for myself.
Now, after graduating from JMU, if I'm not mistaken, you worked as a high school history teacher for 3 years. Talk about your experiences in the classroom, and did you try to share your passion for World War II with your students, and how did that go over?
Sure. Yeah, I was a teacher for 3 years at Fluvanna County High School in Virginia. Again, this is the most unlikely story of how a guy gets to a podcast, because you would think I would have explored history and shared my passion with the students and got all excited about it and got them excited about it. But that's, again, not what happened. Because I was the last one hired, I was teaching classes that had nothing to do with history, whatever the high school needed. And so, again, I have this love of history. I'm on the edge of history. I'm teaching U.S. history to 11th graders, U.S. government to 12th graders. And so I'm on the edge, but it's not moving fully into history. And so, again, it's just there on the side. It's my passion. It's my hobby, but it's not something that I've yet turned into how to make a living out of doing it full time.
Did you find it difficult at all to find students in your class who had any interest in World War II? Because I think about my own experience as a teacher in Mississippi, of all places, after retiring from the Air Force. And I was teaching middle school history and career programs and things like that. And, again, typical history text, it obviously has to cover the broad sweep of history. There's not much time to really get in the nitty-gritty. Yes. And you would find, at my level, the middle school level, students who, again, based on their education that far in the process, really had no idea about World War II or only a tertiary knowledge at best. And it was, in a way, kind of frustrating because we're talking about literally the seminal event of the 20th century.
Yeah, when you're a high school teacher or a middle school teacher and basically the textbook or the curriculum makes it very clear to you, look, you've got half a day on World War II. You've got half a day on the Cold War. Move on. You're just exposing them to it. And I get that concept, but it's very frustrating that you can't go into it. Why is it fascinating? Well, here's why. Well, you just don't have time to do it, and you have to move on to the next chapter.
Now, after teaching, if I'm not mistaken, you moved into the financial services sector, worked there for a number of years. At what point in your career in financial services did you start really thinking about, I'm looking for a podcast on World War II. I'm not seeing what I'm looking for out there, even though the number of podcasts is growing geometrically. At what point did you finally say, by gosh, I guess I'm going to have to do this myself?
Exactly. Well, it was the Christmas of 2009. I had a job at University of Virginia bookstore. Again, books have been a constant in my life. And so my wife gets me basically it comes down to two events. My wife gets me an iPod, which I had no idea what it was or what it could do. And so I started playing with it. And I found podcasts, and then I just knew someone who had taken the time to cover World War II, like Mike Duncan has done the history of Rome, or Cameron Riley and Sir David have covered Napoleon. I just knew there was a chronological story out there, and there wasn't, and it broke my heart. And I just sat there for a couple of months just moping, not, of course, thinking that I could do it. But then 2008 comes along. A 2008 crash, and I lose my job. So I'm got this second-rate job. I've got no money. My life is, I'm at the bottom of the barrel. I needed something in my life to make me happy, some reason to get up in the morning. And I said, well, I've got literally nothing to lose. Let me start a podcast. And so I did. The first one was 11 minutes long. It was 4 pages. I was so nervous. I was so scared. It took me 2 hours to record 4 pages. That's how nervous I was. But I finally had something that I could call my own, and I started in July of 2010.
So you've been actually at this for roughly 12 years now. I've got to ask you, I've heard you mention this, on the podcast, that when you embarked on this project, you thought you could probably sum up World War II in about 50 episodes.
Yeah.
And you're now well past, I think, the 300 episode mark. Your expectations going in, obviously you're a little bit off in the number of episodes that's going to be required to cover the subject. And I should point out, too, that of the 300 plus episodes you've done so far, you've gotten up to basically early 1942. So still a lot of war to be covered.
A lot to go. A long way to go, yeah. Well, at the time I was on, and I know little when it comes to technology, but I was on whatever server Apple had for podcasts. I don't even remember. It's been so long. And they said, I remember there was a thing that says you can use this for free. And I was like, great, but it's only 50. You can only do 50 episodes. And I'd already done 10 or 12. And I went, well, I'm sure I could finish the entire war in 34. What's one episode on Stalingrad? No problem. No, but fortunately, out of the blue, I get an email from a guy named Paul who lives in Scotland. He said, hey, I like what you do. I know computers. Let me help you. And ever since then, it's been so much better.
And then, of course, with that help, you began to realize you would not be constrained by a 50-episode limit or anything like that. Exactly. And again, do you have any rough feel for how many episodes you think will totally be required to cover the entirety of World War II?
Let me answer that by not answering that. I mess things up when I think too much, when I overanalyze, when I try to, as opposed to just going on instinct, or that might sound weird, but this literally isn't overthought too much. I literally started it because I was at a low point in my life, and I wanted to know every little tiny detail about World War II, knowing that I would never achieve that. So this podcast is literally the podcast that I wanted to hear when I first looked at my iPod and there was no World War II podcast. Everything since then has just been filling that void because I was so disappointed. And I don't really think about listeners. I don't think about numbers. I don't think about comments or reviews. This is what I would want to hear if somebody else was doing the pod. And I don't mean that in a disrespectful way, but this is what I would want to hear if somebody else was doing the podcast. So I just jump in.
And now as you're moving through and covering the war in its entirety and everything, again, my hat's off to you, because the sweep of the conflict, we're talking about a global conflict that involved literally scores of countries, battles fought in literally every climate you can imagine, not just by U.S. forces, but by Allied and Axis forces as well. As you began to get involved in this and generate more episodes, was there ever a point where you maybe said to yourself, maybe I should perhaps limit my focus to a certain phase of the war, a certain area of the war, or were we pretty much locked in on the idea of, no, we're going to cover the entire conflict from start to finish?
Right. Well, that's a brilliant question and a brilliant idea, and I wish you had come to me a couple of years ago with that. A little late now. No. It would have made sense, again, to have been more organized, but it was more passion than logic or being thought out. I just jumped into it because I could not do it. And so I just kind of do the best. And you're right. When you start getting to the individual battles, and you can buy 8 different books on the same kind of smaller battle to really get a point of view of everybody who was in the conflict. Yeah, it gets daunting really quickly, but you just, don't think, just do, just get through it. And somehow it works from week to week.
And actually, I think that is probably one of the real strong selling points of your podcast, in the sense that you do get into the minutia of individual engagements and battles. Give you a case in point. I like to think of myself being fairly well read on World War II, knowing a fair amount about the conflict. And of course, we know what happened after Pearl Harbor. The Allies suffer a string of defeats in Southeast Asia, to include Japan conquering the Philippines and forcing the surrender of U.S. forces on Bataan. And, for many years, I just simply believed that this was truly not MacArthur's finest hour, that the Americans were essentially doomed with the sinking of our fleet in Pearl Harbor, because War Plan Orange and the other war plans that were, focused on the defense of the Philippines, they were really contingent upon that fleet being able to sail across the Pacific to win a Jutland-style battle and then relieve the U.S. garrison there in the Philippines. And when, after Pearl Harbor, no way that was going to happen. But what I didn't realize was, despite those long odds against U.S. forces in the early months of 1942 in the Philippines, in many ways we actually fought a fairly successful, although losing, campaign, because you bring out some of the smaller points. For example, the Battle of the Pockets, the Battle of the Points, where the U.S. was able to delay the Japanese advance, and our forces under Jonathan Wainwright, who was MacArthur's ground forces commander, actually acquitted themselves pretty well against some very long odds. And again, that's the kind of thing that even many history books on the campaign will tend to gloss over. And I think you do a really great job in bringing that out to the listener.
Yeah, I appreciate that, because, again, going into it is like, I want to understand, why did Bataan take this amount of time? Why, what happened? What were the details? And I truly believe if you and I could get in a time machine and go back to Bataan at the right time and give them a whole bunch of food and shells, they would probably still be there today holding out. I mean, those guys were tough. If it wasn't for the lack of supplies, they would have lasted a lot longer. So, yeah, it was those kind of details. How did this happen? Why did this happen? That's exactly what I wanted to find out and share it with everybody.
I want to talk a little bit about the production process, because, again, you generate an enormous amount of content. I should point out, too, that, you typically produce 4 free episodes a month that anybody can access. But for folks that want to sign up for your premium service, and that's on my Christmas wish list this year, you generate 2 additional podcasts for those members. So that's a lot of material to research, to write, to voice, and then to get posted each month. Talk about the production process. What goes into producing a typical episode of the History of World War II podcast?
Right. I'd be happy to. And also, just to hopefully impress you even further, I do several podcasts with a friend, Cameron Riley. We do the Renaissance, the Cold War, the life of the Caesars. And so all that's going on at the same time as this. So I just want you to be impressed with me. So
and I am. I am.
No, okay. So basically the World War II process, it changes from week to week, because, like a lot of people, there are some things that I know very well, and there are some things that I don't, and it's brand new to me, or I will literally stumble across something. And that's when I get most excited. So to answer your question, I take my basis, that is my general knowledge of World War II. I know what I want to cover next, and I find 4 or 5 books on that particular event. And I'll read through those, and I'll just let it marinate. I'll just let it, everything that I just read will just sit in my head. I'll go for a walk with the dog, and he loves it. And when I come back, I've got my general point of view. I've got my angle. I kind of know where I want my cliffhangers to be, and the stuff that I'm going to say that's either going to shock you or make you laugh or whatever. Because even in war, there are bits of hilarity that sometimes you just need to break up the drama. But I just get a sense of what I'm going to say. I just needed the details from the research. And then I just start writing. And again, I don't overthink it. It just pours out and I don't interrupt the process. Does that make sense?
It makes perfect sense. And, bringing out some of those moments of levity and hilarity in wartime, I think is very important. And good example of that, I was listening to your series on the Malta campaign. Again, a very critical campaign to keeping the Mediterranean under Allied control, keeping the shipping lanes to Egypt and beyond open during the war. And here's this one little island controlled by the British holding out against the Italians and the Germans. And you highlight this RAF, maybe it was Royal Navy, reconnaissance pilot. And this gentleman, apparently, he barely got his wings.
Right.
Warburton or Warby? He had enormous trouble with takeoffs and landings, so they were hesitant to let him actually take an aircraft up. But once he got in the sky, he had an unmatched ability to get into enemy defenses and get the piece of photographic information the British really needed, all the way up to Admiral Cunningham, to, further the British plan, the war plan there in the Mediterranean. And yet, again, this is the kind of individual that in the big sweep, the typical history book, you're either not going to hear about him or you're going to get very little about this individual.
Yeah. And in fact, I just introduced a second character, if you will. His name is Tommy Thompson. He just came in with the 249 Squadron, RAF. And you're right. There's something about these two people that either they're bad decision makers or they have bad luck or whatever, but they literally can't make anything in their life go right. They screw it all up. But you put them in either, like for Warburton, you put him in a bomber where he can take pictures, or for Tommy Thompson, you put him in a Hurricane and a fighter, and suddenly everything in their brains just click. It makes sense. And they go on and they achieve incredible things and they help the war effort. But what I want to find out is what happens to them after the war when they're out of the uniform, when they're out of the war machine. Do they go back to being kind of bungling people, or did they grow in that experience? And that's something I'm looking forward to examining further.
And we look forward to you exploring that as well. In terms of a typical episode, you mentioned the fact that, you do a lot of research and everything, but when you sit down and actually record that segment, how much of that is fully scripted and how much of that is simply material that you've got in your mind and kind of a feel already for how you want to present it, and you're literally just kind of ad-libbing that particular episode?
Yeah, no, it's like 99.5% scripted. When I did the first 10 episodes, it was scripted. The next 10 episodes were ad-libbed with some notes in my hand, and I didn't like the imprecision. I didn't like I didn't like the whatever. And I don't really, this is going to sound strange. I don't think I'm really good at this. I don't think I have a great voice. I don't think I present it very well, but I think I can offer something as a writer. So I take the information and I think what I write is decent, and then I just read it, and hopefully it's compelling enough as a story that you're hooked. But I don't think I have the voice for it or whatever, and I just kind of go with my strengths and I focus on the writing.
Well, the funny thing, and I say this as someone who worked in broadcasting before I had the good sense to join the Air Force and everything, in this day and age, it's really not so much about the tone of the voice. In fact, the guidance that many advertisers and others will give when they're looking for talent, they'll say, we don't want the announcer type. We don't want, the pear-shaped tones and all that kind of stuff. So that's probably why I'm in education now and not back in radio. But, the real thing there is the content. And you do a marvelous job, again, in bringing out all this detail and stitching it together into a really coherent whole and then presenting that. So, I think, tonal quality is of minor consideration, and the real star of the podcast, obviously, is your passion for the material, the way you organize and research and write, and then the way you produce that. Now, I was just curious, for many years, you were holding down a full-time job and producing the podcast.
Yes.
What was that experience like?
I didn't have a life. Nothing happened. And I'll make this real quick. Yeah, no, but basically by the time you work 9 to 5, you come home, you have your meal, you help your kids with their homework, kiss the wife on the forehead, and then you spend the couple hours before you go to bed working. Yeah, I think I got caught up into it, and it fed my ego, and money slowly started coming in, but I was just enjoying the sense of accomplishment. Like when I first started, I want to hear a World War II podcast. And so I got excited after each episode came out. But about a year, I've been doing this full time for about exactly 4 years. And just over 4 years ago, my wife said, I'm getting tired of seeing the top of your head. Because whenever I was sitting down, I was just bent down over a book. She said, you need to quit one of these. And I bluffed at that point. I said, well, I'm quitting my job, my day job. And she was supposed to say, no, you're quitting the podcast because we want you back in the family, and that's money and that's health benefits or whatever. But she didn't say that. She said, fine, go ahead. She called my bluff. And so I panicked, quit my job, and then doubled down on the podcast, even though I had no idea what I was doing as far as business or technology. I just focused on the content. And like you were saying earlier, I think my sincerity gets me through, and when maybe other parts like my voice wouldn't. I think the sincerity that I really do appreciate and respect those people who went through all this, I think that helps me a lot in the end.
Now, you mentioned the business end of podcasting. We have people out there that are looking to launch a podcast. Maybe they have one already. Any advice you would give to them in terms of how to make a podcast successful and how to successfully monetize what you're doing out there? Because, we hear stories about people that are making just vast sums of money hosting a podcast. But the reality is that many people that have a podcast, we don't really have an idea about how to put together an effective business plan and really make it profitable.
Right. Off the top of my head, in no particular order, one, go ahead and invest in the equipment because it's 2021. Nobody wants to hear a lame sounding podcast, and then at the end, the person goes, "Oh, I'm really sorry, I don't have a great microphone, or I don't have whatever." No, do your job and get good equipment. Second of all, just build up a body of work. Get a couple of episodes out there. Don't expect to put out 2 episodes and go, okay, who wants to sign me up to $1 million deal? It just doesn't work that way. But you get a body of work and you learn the process, and then the podcast truly takes on whatever voice it was supposed to take on all along. You just didn't know what it was. You stumbled into it, and then it gets as good as it's going to get, and then it's word of mouth. You want to bring other people on the show if you can to get it to spread, but it's all about quality. Basically comes down to this, and I'm sorry, I should have answered with this question. When I listen to a podcast, you either better be entertaining me or teaching me something new. If I don't go, oh, or laugh in 5 minutes, you're wasting my time. So bring something new to the table, and that will hook people faster than anything else.
Those are very, very good words of advice. Now, you mentioned earlier that you actually launched the podcast back in 2012. How long was it before you began to receive feedback on what you were putting out there? And how long was it before you began to realize, I think I'm on the right track here?
Right. And again, you have to keep in mind, when I started this, it was literally nothing more than to fill a gap in my life. I wasn't looking for emails. I wasn't looking for donations or anything. And so 3 months into it, I get an email and someone says, hey, I like what you're doing. Keep it up. That was pretty much it. But it made my day. I was like, oh my God, people write you? This is the greatest thing in the world. And of course, a couple of months later, I got another email. You stink at this. I didn't like your series on Hitler's bio or whatever. And I'm like, oh, I'm sorry. And so, don't get too excited when you get a compliment. Don't get too down when you get criticism. Just stay true to yourself.
Absolutely. Absolutely. You mentioned earlier your sincerity, and I really think that's a quality that comes through in the History of World War II podcast. What else about the podcast do you think has made it successful? What is it that really makes it resonate with listeners?
Ooh, that's a tough one. I think I acknowledge that I'm standing on the shoulders of giants, the amazing, brave men and women who fought, the civilians, the people in the uniform. Those are giants. The people who have taken their lives to write books about those people, those are giants as well. I literally just get to benefit from all their work. And so I think as long as you're telling a good story, it has a beginning, it has moments of drama, and then it has a cliffhanger. Because I've gotten emails about, there's a married couple in Canada who work in a lab during the night shift. I don't know what they do. They test stuff, and they listen to the podcast. There's an Australian trucker who, obviously Australia is quite big. He's on the road for many hours a day. He'll let the episodes build up, and then he'll just burn through like 10 of them at one time. There's a father and son who the father drives his son to school and they listen to the episode and they email me this. So, again, it is important for me not to think about all these people out there, because I'll get in my own head, and that's never a good thing. As long as I stick to the story and I'm doing a good episode each time, everything else falls in place, and I let it fall in place. Like FDR, I learned from FDR a long time ago, don't make any decisions unless you absolutely have to, because things have a way of working themselves out. So
absolutely,
I just do the best I can and let everything else take care of itself.
We'll continue our conversation with Ray Harris Jr. in just a moment. But first, a reminder, it's that time of year. Christmas is just around the corner, and so is the new year. Make 2022 the year you start, continue, or finish your education. At Thomas Nelson, we're always ready to help. We've been educating members of the military community for over 50 years. We've got more than 80 degree and certificate programs, many of them completely online. And we're affordable. If you're using military tuition assistance, you will automatically receive a tuition discount no matter where you're stationed. And credits earned at TNCC will easily transfer to other colleges and universities. In fact, we've got articulation agreements with more than 40 other institutions. Learn more about what we can do to help you achieve your educational goals. Visit tncc.edu/military, or if you prefer, contact us by phone. You can reach the team that handles active duty, Guard and Reserve personnel, and military spouses. Their number, 757-825-2938. And if you're using VA benefits, call 757-825-4075. Success, it's closer than you think, at Thomas Nelson, the Peninsula's community college. Just out of curiosity, roughly how many listeners is each episode of the History of World War II podcast attracting right now?
It's about just over 50,000. There are times people love to cherry pick, and that's fine because I do the same thing. Certain episodes, like when the Eastern Front, it goes up to 75, 80,000. So it just depends, but I know I'm going to get a good 50,000.
And that's a very impressive number, considering the fact that I think there's something like 2 million podcasts out there in the environment right now. So there's not a shortage of material. When you began the podcast back in 2012, there were a relative handful, and now there's just everything under the sun to choose from, including this podcast as well. Going back to World War II as a subject, as we're talking here with Ray Harris Jr., creator and host of the History of World War II podcast, there's been a real avalanche of books and films, TV shows on the subject over the last 25 years. It kind of really began with Tom Brokaw's book, The Greatest Generation. And it seems like, 80 years after the war began, there's still a lot of interest. Do you see that continuing, even as members of the World War II generation keep leaving us in ever-increasing numbers?
I do see it sticking around, and I hope it sticks around because, oh my goodness, I'll try to condense this. One, you need to study that war because you need to be able to recognize evil before it gets too big. And so if you see patterns repeating, you need to do something about that. Two, it wasn't, even though for them it was a very technologically advanced war, for us it's child's play. We have computer games that are more advanced than the war systems back in 1945. So, and this is going to, I don't know how this sounds, but it was like the last war where people really had to get in each other's face. It was real hand-to-hand combat. And there's a certain amount of respect you have to give for that kind of courage, because I know I couldn't do it. But I don't think the interest is going anywhere, and I don't think it should go anywhere. And as you well know, history keeps repeating itself. So we need to learn from history so we can see other potential threats as they come over the horizon.
What role do you see podcasting in playing in sustaining interest in World War II and making it more accessible to a younger audience? Because let's face it, we've got people out there right now that, they're not really crazy about buying a book or going to a library, but, they've got their device loaded with podcasts. So here's a great way to learn about the subject in a format and a venue that's convenient to them.
Yeah. Well, I think it's appropriate that you mentioned the book, because I was up at Boston conference a couple of years ago, and one listener was joking with me that if there was a subject that he was interested in, he would not, and I think this is the average mentality of a lot of people, he would not walk across the street for a free book on a subject that he was interested in. However, if it's already in his phone that he carries with him constantly, and all he has to do is push a button, not not too lazy to do that. But I think it's great because people, they'll listen to an episode that they can control. They can stop it at any time they want. They can skip it. But the great thing is they're like, oh, I got to find out more about that. Ray touched on it, but it wasn't enough. I want more. And they go do a deep dive. To me, that's the most exciting thing. If I can get you excited about this content and you do your own study, reading, investigation, or whatever, my work is done. I just wanted you to know that this information exists and you need to know it to a certain degree to prepare ourselves for the future.
You mentioned earlier some of the people that have given you feedback on the podcast and people that listen on a frequent basis, the lab technicians in Canada, the trucker in Australia. Do you find the typical listener to your podcast is somebody who was already a World War II buff, or do you find a lot of new converts on the topic, or kind of a mix of those two groups?
Right. I'm going to guess based on the emails that I get. I don't know if I've converted too many people, but I have had plenty of people say, I am curious. I am interested. I want to know more. And you're the only one who's doing a full-length podcast on it. So thank you very much. Because you can read a book, a single volume about World War II, but unless it's like 10,000 pages, they're going to leave a ton out. And so if someone, and this is the best way I can describe it, the most valuable thing that someone has, which is priceless, it is beyond price, is their time. And if they take the time to download and listen to my episode, they take 30 minutes out of their day, I'm grateful. It's more than I ever asked for. So if they're willing to do that, I'm certainly going to give it my all and keep putting out episodes.
We mentioned, again, that you're one of the few podcasters on World War II, perhaps the only one who's covering the entirety of the war. And obviously, you've done a tremendous amount of research and looking into everything that's happened in the conflict so far. And again, you're up to the early months of 1942. In the research and the podcasting you've done so far, what is the most interesting or unique thing you've stumbled across that maybe you were not previously aware of about the Second World War?
One, as much as I thought I understood courage under fire, courage despite being afraid. I've seen so many examples of that. And just in the moments of in between the shooting, because when they're shooting, you get all worked up. You don't have time to think. You just have to defend yourself. But just imagine the down moments of Dunkirk or the down moments of the Battle of Britain when the pilots are just sitting there waiting for their next call to jump in the plane, maybe for the third time that day. And they're risking their lives. And so I think just the amount of courage that goes into, because we all think we're tough. You watch a movie, oh, I could handle that. That's BS. The courage to literally take on another person to defend yourself. I think between that, and I'm sure you've heard this expression before, what's the difference between a civilian and a soldier? It's the training. I don't think I truly appreciated all the training that these guys and ladies had to go through just to get to the spot. Because you hear a story, oh, I signed up and I was given a uniform and 4 months later I'm, whatever. No, there's like training for like 6 and 10 months, especially for the pilots, the bombers, and that kind of stuff. And so the professionalism, the training, and the courage, as much as I thought I understood it, my respect went to a whole new level going into these stories.
That's a really good point you're bringing up there, Ray, because, we often focus on the battles, the conflicts, the engagements, and certainly, that's what ultimately, won the war for the Allied side. But the logistics of fielding that army, of building the largest navy the world has ever seen, of producing tens of thousands of aircraft in a year, which is what the U.S. did literally from a standing start in 1940-41. And then by the time you reach 1944-45, we had built more bombers, talking about, medium bombers, light bombers, heavy bombers. I think we built something like 97,000. And that was more than the rest of the world combined, Allied and Axis.
Yeah.
And the enormity of that project, just that alone. And then, like you said, creating the training pipelines that took young men who were either already in the military, most of them were civilian at the time of Pearl Harbor, put them through the required training, gave them the skill, the knowledge they would need to put them in that position where they were able to carry the day and help win a battle. I mean, it's we had 16 million Americans in uniform in World War II. we'll never see that kind of number again. And just, again, the logistics and the mechanics and the enormity of equipping and training and preparing all those people and then getting to where they had to be to carry out their job. It's something I really don't think gets the attention that really deserves.
Yeah. When I was a little kid, I respected the Army. I respected the military in general because my father taught me in most instances, not that the military is perfect, but the military has one question: what works? If it doesn't work, get out of my way, give me something or someone that works or whatever. And you have to imagine, like you just said, millions of people were mobilized, trained, fed, put in uniforms. They had to build the trucks, the planes, they had to ship them out, whatever. And so, and it really makes you wistful. If you look at how American society is today, we're at each other's throats versus right after Pearl Harbor. I mean, the country came together almost 100%. There was no more fighting. It was us against them. And there was a unity and there was a patriotism that, unfortunately, I don't know if we'll ever get that back again, but that kind of coming together to solve a problem on a national scale is absolutely impressive.
Absolutely. In your research and podcasting on World War II so far, again, we're talking about, things that maybe have not received the attention or scrutiny or even scholarly research that perhaps they deserve. On the other side of that coin, are there certain topics, individuals that you think maybe are not only overrated, but maybe they've received a little too much attention?
Yeah, there are certain people who knew how to grab the headlines. MacArthur comes to mind, who practically invented press relations for the Army. And going by results alone, even though I generally like him, Arthur Percival, who was the British commander when Malaya fell. He had 130,000 troops, and yet they still fall to the Japanese, who had half that number in almost just a matter of weeks. And so you've as much as I like Arthur Percival, you've got to be honest about the results when he was in charge. MacArthur is someone I have a love-hate relationship with. There's so much about him not to like, but by the end of the war, he has become the consummate commander. He knows how to weave together the land troops, the Navy, and the Air Force in a way that just leaves the Japanese reeling. He doesn't start out well, but by the time it's over with, MacArthur knows how to use a force to go at the enemy. And so he's another one who, because he loved himself so much and he talked about himself so much, too much in the press, should back down a little bit. But in the end, he got the job done. He
did. And I think perhaps his greatest monument is not necessarily his record in World War II, which, again, as you point out, was impeccable after the fall of the Philippines. His handling of our campaign in New Guinea, for example. Yeah. He took Rabaul, which was the Japan's most important fortress outside the home islands. Absolutely. And by bypassing Rabaul, by working through New Guinea, then into the Admiralty Islands, he essentially turned Rabaul into the world's largest self-guarding POW camp.
Exactly. Brilliant. Yeah, and I don't know if he got that idea from Nimitz and Halsey, but the point is, there comes a point when MacArthur, even though he's still blustery, he starts being a better, smarter commander. And it's decisions like that helped him and, but more importantly, saved a lot of his men's lives.
Absolutely. Now, looking ahead as you plan out your podcasting over the next half of the war and everything, are there certain areas, elements, campaigns that maybe you think have not received enough attention per se that you plan to focus a little bit more on?
I think the Aleutian Islands. I already did a little mini series on the Aleutian Islands. Might have to go back and visit that, but that gets short shrift. And when it was connected to Midway, the Battle of Midway, and it's also connected to making the Japanese feel less secure about their advance, especially when they stop advancing late 1941. To be honest, I'm not sure. I can't wait to go deep details about the Eastern Front. Even though there's a lot that I don't know, there's a lot that I'm looking forward to learning. And so I think something like that. And just in New Guinea, I'm looking forward to Papua New Guinea because, again, there's a lot that I didn't know about that. And some amazing defensive fighting was going on there to stop the Japanese from getting Port Moresby. So again, some very important moments in history that they need to have the light shine on them.
And the funny thing about the New Guinea campaign in the early phases that you're talking about there, much of the fighting on the Allied side was done by Australian reserve troops.
Yes, they were not happy to be there. Sorry, go ahead.
And I could well imagine. And you think about it, because when World War II began in 1939, Australia being part of the British Empire, their best troops were summoned to Europe, more appropriately North Africa. So the folks left behind are essentially the Australian version of the National Guard, the reserve, and these are the guys who were thrown in against some of the elite of the Japanese army in New Guinea, and they were bloodied and they had to give ground. In fact, the Japanese advanced so far that they were literally in the hills above Port Moresby before the Australians were able to start pushing them back. But they did push them back and carry the day. And that's, again, a campaign, I think, that, like you said earlier, really probably deserves more attention, more scrutiny, because the conditions in New Guinea were absolutely horrific in terms of the climate, raining all the time, disease.
Humidity. Yes, absolutely. Yeah, a lot of the men, when they got there, not only did they not know they were going to go there, I think it was one of the regiments tried to turn the ship around and go back, but a lot of them brought their golf clubs and bathing suits. And I'm like, no, that's not what's going to go on here. But they grew up really fast. And like you said, they did an admirable job in stopping the enemy.
They really did. And for the Japanese, from that perspective there, obviously very few Japanese soldiers were able to return from far-flung battlefields because of the Japanese code that was much more honorable to die or to kill yourself than to surrender. I remember hearing about a Japanese survivor of New Guinea who wrote a book that was actually a bestseller in Japan. And when he made it back home, he became a curiosity. Literally thousands of people would come to his home because he was that rare Japanese soldier who survived New Guinea. And in the Japanese army, I think you may have mentioned this on the podcast, New Guinea was the one place where Japanese soldiers never returned from.
Yeah, it was between the mosquitoes, the fighting, and the fact that it was being surrounded by the Allied Navy. Those guys weren't going anywhere. And that's one of the things that fascinates me in a very strange way. So on one hand, the Japanese are like, we will never surrender, and so we don't do well when we have prisoners because we don't respect you. We don't see you as human. And so they're going to be very cruel to their captors just because of their own point of view. But again, that point of view also led to Pearl Harbor, where they thought, well, declaring war is stupid. It's better to strike first and then let them know. And so that was their mentality. And obviously we think differently. We didn't respect it, but they ended up paying a horrible price for their particular warrior code.
Indeed. Now, as an airman, I'd be remiss if I didn't ask you this. You talked about some of the things you plan to cover in future episodes of the podcast.
Yeah.
Talk about some of the air campaigns, the air leaders that perhaps you plan to feature or talk about in future episodes of the podcast.
Yeah, I'm still trying to find a good, enough resources. I want to understand better when Berlin started bombing Germany, how they kept it going when the Americans got involved, that kind of thing. And so I'm looking forward to the slow transition of who controls the skies over Germany or the Nazi Empire, if you will. And also I've been in my membership episodes, I'm currently doing Pappy Boyington, how he helps with go up the Solomon Islands. And so this question of slowly taking the air from the enemy, because you pay a price, it happens gradually. It normally doesn't just happen in one go. And it's in fact, it's such a gradual process. Sometimes you don't even realize that you're now in control or the enemy is backed away until, sometime later. And so I'm looking forward to exploring how the German pilots, who are amazing, they had amazing aircraft, but in the end, they do lose control over their skies. And for the Japanese, again, their pilots were well experienced. They had years of fighting in China, and yet they lose to the Allied pilots over time. So that is that transition is something I'm looking forward to covering.
And we're looking forward to hearing it as well. And another element, too, I'm sure you'll bring out in those episodes of the podcast is there was a belief that, the guys who fought in the air, the airmen had it easy because they were going back home to a base and they had hot meals and they got frequent passes to London in the case of 8th and 9th Air Force crews and things like that, without realizing that half of all the men who were crew in RAF Bomber Command in World War II died. Most of them in action, several thousand in accidents, but 55,000 out of 120,000 killed in action. That is a staggering number. And among the 8th Air Force, our heavy bomber command out of England in World War II, they lost more crew members killed than the Marine Corps lost in the Pacific in World War II.
Yeah, that's staggering. And you probably know this better than I do, but I think until the Mustang fighter comes along with its range, the Allied bombers, they were just getting torn up. They were being decimated. And when you shoot down a plane, it's not just one person. It's an entire crew. Exactly. That's probably going to die. So absolutely the courage, the number of sorties they had to do in a day, much less overall. And, the number keeps getting raised. Again, very brave people doing something that I could not picture myself doing. And they did it day in and day out.
Absolutely. They never wavered. Our guest here is Ray Harris Jr. He's the creator and host of the History of World War II podcast. Highly recommended listening. If you have any interest in military history, make sure you check it out. Ray, again, would not be doing things properly if I didn't ask you about how people can access your podcast and about the website that's a companion for your podcast.
Sure. Well, the good news is because I've been doing this for so long, if you just do a general search on World War II podcast or Ray Harris podcast, I guarantee you will pop up, but I think it's a History of World War II podcast.net. But trust me, you just put in Ray Harrison podcast and everything that I do will pop up and you can see it there. You can get a feel for the membership episodes as you were saying earlier, because that was something I wanted to do, just some of the backstories of World War II. So you've got the main feed that's free, and then you've got the 2 extra episodes for members, and that's just something just so I can go into little tiny stories behind the main story that is World War II.
As we kind of wrap up our conversation here, we're taping this particular installment of At Ease just a few days after the 80th anniversary of Pearl Harbor, and I, again, would be remiss if I didn't briefly touch on this topic. Since December 7th, 1941, there's been kind of an American mantra of no more Pearl Harbors, but yet we've been surprised militarily and from an intelligence perspective on multiple occasions since that time. You think about China's entry into the Korean War, the Tet Offensive in Vietnam, various conflicts that happened overseas that we failed to anticipate, and of course the events of September 11th, 2001. Do you think the fact that we say no more Pearl Harbors, but we keep experiencing surprises like a Pearl Harbor in more recent times, do you think that indicates that perhaps we as a nation have not really learned the lesson of Pearl Harbor?
I think that's true. I also think there's cognitive dissonance involved. I think there's a matter of ego, because if you go back and read almost any book on Pearl Harbor, you'll be like, okay, guys, listen up. The Japanese, they could attack us at anywhere, anytime. And then messages start coming through about, the planes coming towards Pearl Harbor, and no one believes it. And they're like, well, yeah, they can attack anywhere, but they're not going to attack here. I mean, you've got to, when you're in national security or you're in the military or whatever, you've got to remember this moment in history. And it's like, don't assume anything. What's that old expression when you play chess? Play the board. Don't play the opponent. What's really going on in the situation. And I think there's a certain amount of arrogance or overconfidence that you can have as a warrior. And so the enemy is always going to try to find new ways to beat you. So don't just assume that you're always going to win. But that's a prime example of literally people going, this could never happen. And so they don't see it, even though it's right in their face, kind of like Afghanistan, or September 11th. And so, again, it's important to learn to learn these lessons, but it just seems so hard to do. And obviously we're still struggling with how to do that. Indeed.
And you mentioned, there was arrogance on our part, and there was a touch of racism, too, in the years leading up to Pearl Harbor, the assumption that Japanese were less capable soldiers, sailors, airmen, that Japanese aircraft could never match American products. And yet, at the same time, there was information coming in from the Flying Tigers in China saying the Japanese Zero, the Mitsubishi Zero, is a much better aircraft than the P-40. And if you want to get into a turning dogfight with the Zero, you're going to die. Your best hope is to have an altitude advantage, dive through the formation, make your attack, and then get the heck out of there and regroup and live to fight another day. And we, also discovered that the Japanese sailor was better trained. They certainly had, from a surface warfare standpoint, from a submarine standpoint, far better torpedoes than what we had the early days of the war. Their pilots in the Japanese fleet were simply superb. And you saw that, the execution of Pearl Harbor, some of the earlier attacks there. So, we completely underestimated the Japanese leading up to Pearl Harbor. The irony that you talk about is the fact that we know that so much of Japanese military doctrine going back to the Russo-Japanese War was predicated on the decisive surprise attack to paralyze and reduce your enemy from the opening moment. And yet we ignored that. At the same time, we were also ignoring our own lessons, because there were countless Pacific Fleet exercises in the 1920s and 1930s that featured a surprise aerial attack on Pearl Harbor, some of which were staged on a weekend.
Yes. Yeah. And one of them was a Sunday morning as well, and it worked brilliantly. And you think there would have been immediate changes at Pearl, but no, it doesn't happen that way. Again, who knows, cognitive dissonance or whatever, but you have to consider all the possibilities when you're in a potential war situation, and they weren't, and they were complacent, and they got caught with their pants down. But in the end, Japan obviously paid the ultimate price.
They did. And whenever we talk about Pearl Harbor, we always hear the various conspiracy theories, and, these invariably surface, and, there's not a lot of real hard evidence to back them up, but people still trot them out. The idea that Roosevelt wanted to expose the fleet, use it as bait there at Pearl Harbor, inviting an attack so America could finally enter the war. Your thoughts on those theories? Is there any credence to them?
Well, first of all, there's a lot to admire about FDR, but you have to keep in mind that he was a politician. He was smiling at you, trying to get your vote. Having said that, he was a rather brilliant man, very well read. He traveled the world. He did not want to get involved in the war. He really thought for a while that if he gave everyone else enough weapons, we wouldn't have to get involved. I don't think FDR knew about some secret attack at Pearl Harbor. I think that's going too far. The most I'm willing to concede is that FDR was smart enough not to write anything down. If he had a secret like that, it went with him to the grave. But no, I mean, if you think about it, think of the moment right before Pearl Harbor. Again, there's messages going all over the Pacific, and the message basically is, we're pretty sure Japan's going to attack us. We don't know where. It could come anywhere at any time. That's pretty darn vague. And to say, oh, you should have figured out it was Pearl Harbor, I think that's a bit much. I think he was caught off guard as much as anybody else.
And I think really the entire military establishment was caught off guard that day. Because like you said, we knew the Japanese carrier force was at sea. We didn't know where. There's somewhere in the Pacific. Well, that's a pretty big piece of water. So, pinning them down is going to be pretty difficult, especially given the limitations of aerial reconnaissance back during the early 1940s. And, yes, we had some ability to break the Japanese code, especially JN-25, but that was not giving us the complete picture. And we were only getting bits and pieces of what we were able to decrypt, despite the efforts of some really brilliant people like Joseph Rochefort, who ran Station Hypo at Pearl Harbor, and the other code-breaking operations, both U.S., British, and even Dutch, across the Pacific. So we were getting pieces of the puzzle, but not the entire puzzle. And I think from an intel perspective, as someone who spent a good chunk of their life in the intel community, that's an important, I think, element that people don't really appreciate. Often you do have to work from pieces of the puzzle, but leading up to December 7th, 1941, there were so many pieces missing that, no one could definitively say the Japanese carrier force is at sea. We knew it was, but it's heading for Pearl Harbor. They're going to launch an attack. And in fact, the smart money, both in D.C. and in the Pacific, was thinking the Philippines, French Indochina, Singapore, places like that, which were attacked in the subsequent days and everything, but nobody could really foresee what was going to happen there at Pearl Harbor. One final question on Pearl Harbor as we kind of wrap things up here, Ray. In your research and podcasting on that topic, is there anything that you find intriguing or fascinating about Pearl Harbor that maybe you didn't know before you began doing this?
That's a good question. The irony that surrounds Pearl Harbor. One, like you said, we didn't know where their fleet was. So many things had to fall into place for the Japanese fleet to sail across that part of the Pacific and yet not be discovered. It was almost like the perfect storm of events, so they weren't discovered. I get that. But at the same time, the Americans were certainly doing their part by being absolutely lazy. It was Sunday. They were hungover. As far as what I learned, just the sheer... What's that old saying? The Romans saying a lot. Fortune favors the bold, and so even though obviously I'm American, I wanted the Americans to win. But one thing I really learned from Pearl Harbor is sometimes you do strike out, sometimes you are bold, sometimes you defy the odds, and it will work out in your favor. Is it a matter of luck? I don't know what to call that, but sometimes you have to be bold just because it will work. And the Japanese prove that. And so the Americans are going to do that over and over again. They're certainly going to be bold while they're militarily weak in the Pacific for the next 6 months after Pearl Harbor. But again, just sometimes audacity is needed.
Absolutely. And I think that's a really good point because, again, in the days after Pearl Harbor, we began to borrow from the Japanese playbook by launching the Doolittle Raid, which the Japanese were not expecting in April of 1942. And even the U.S. at Midway, the Japanese were not expecting to find 3 American carriers near Midway ready to engage the main body of the Japanese fleet in early June of 1942. They thought there might be a token American force in the area. They thought that we were too weak. They thought after the Yorktown was heavily damaged at Coral Sea that we would not be able to put any significant force to sea to defend Midway that soon. And again, the Japanese paid a price for that. They lost 4 fleet carriers, the cream of their naval aviation aircrew cadre, and it would haunt them for the remainder of the war.
Yeah. The one thing, when someone quits trying to find out information about their opponent, or when their attitude is, I don't know what my opponent is up to, but it doesn't matter because as soon as I meet him, I'll beat him. That's normally the beginning of the end for you because you can't fight a war like that. You have to have intelligence. You have to know what's going on. You have to plan for the unexpected. And so for the Japanese to pull up and go, well, whatever is out there in front of us, we can handle it no problem. Well, again, obviously that didn't turn out. And the Americans, like you said, were borrowing from the Japanese and they were able to break some of their code and they knew what was happening. And the Americans, even with their limited resources, planned accordingly. Absolutely.
Once again, Ray, give us the website and tell us about how folks can sign up for your premium service.
Sure. You can find everything, fortunately, at World War II History.net. Now, hold on. You think I would know my own podcast. It's only been 12 years or whatever, but History of World War II Podcast.net. You can find everything there. You can sign up for a membership. Ask me any questions. You can communicate. But, yeah, check it out. And I hope people get from it what they're looking for, because that's why I started the podcast in the first place.
And last question, are you still selling the Churchill mugs?
I have the Churchill mugs. I've got 4 left. I meant to do something for Christmas, but people have already figured it out and they're flying off the shelf. And so, yeah, if you want a Churchill mug, send me an email and I'll take care of it.
Outstanding. We've been talking today with Ray Harris Jr., a fellow Virginian. He is the creator and host of the History of World War II podcast. You can find that on virtually all of the podcasting platforms out there. And as we said earlier, if you have any interest in military history, especially World War II history, this is definitely recommended listening. It's appointment listening. I listen to it each week. And again, I learn something new every time. Ray, again, best to you and your family. Hope you have a Merry Christmas. And thank you so much for joining us here on the podcast.
Thank you, sir. Take care.
All right. Have a good day. This has been At Ease, the military podcast of Thomas Nelson Community College. I'm Gary Pounder. Thanks for listening.